In 2018, Grace Millane was just beginning to live her life to the fullest. She was from Wickford in Essex in the United Kingdom, and she was taking a year off from her bachelor's degree at the University of Lincoln, where she was studying advertising and marketing. She was creative and an artist, and friends described her as someone who was deeply loyal and always had the biggest, brightest smile on her face. It was a smile that we'd get to see in many of her pictures taken throughout her gap year, especially on her backpacking trips across the world. Grace started in South America, where she spent 6 weeks before jumping onto a plane and heading for her next big adventure. This time, her destination was New Zealand, and she touched down on November 20th, 2018 to start seeing what the island had to offer. But 2 weeks into her stay, on the 1st of December, she decided to do something really special. It was the day before her 22nd birthday, and with her friends and family halfway across the world, Grace decided to reach out and find someone to spend the evening with. She was staying at the City Life Hotel, which was a mixture of affordable hotel rooms and privately owned apartments, so the building was often filled with people living there for an extended period of time and others just coming and going. This meant that the lobby and places like the staircases were common areas where guests and residents would meet in passing, and one full-time resident was Jesse Kempson, a 26-year-old man originally from the Wellington region of New Zealand. Exactly what is and isn't true about Jesse's past is a bit difficult to pin down because Jesse had a tendency to tell people different versions of his story, but what we do know for certain is that his parents divorced when he was 9. Shortly after the divorce, Jesse's mother moved overseas, leaving Jesse to be raised by his father and his paternal grandfather. Jesse would later claim that his parents' divorce had a lasting effect on him, and things didn't get better when his father remarried. He would tell some people that he was close with all of his siblings. He would tell others that he never saw his mother's side of the family, and wished that he could be in better touch with his half-siblings. And he would tell others that his mother was dying of cancer. Cancer, or a terminal illness of some kind, was something that Jesse would come back to in several versions of his story. Sometimes he would say that his mother was dying, that she was already dead, or sometimes he would say that he was suffering from some sort of terminal illness, to either get sympathy from people he was in contact with, or sometimes to explain why other pieces of his story were not quite adding up. And he had a habit of telling stories. After getting in trouble for drinking and driving, Jesse moved to Sydney, Australia, to try and get a fresh start. He worked various jobs but never seemed to hold one down for long, before he decided that he would move back to New Zealand and try again. But by then, his family had severed ties with him over his constant lying, and he knew that he couldn't move back home. His whole move to Sydney had been the result of his family giving him an ultimatum to begin with. After his DUI, his father and his stepmother had asked him to change his lifestyle, to stop lying and try to be an active part of their family or go his own way, and Jesse chose to try to make it on his own. But with no job on the horizon and no family home to come back to, Jesse had to figure out where he could stay. He first made a video call from Sydney to a home where 3 girls were living. They were looking for a new flatmate, and when Jesse explained that he was living in Sydney and was looking to buy a restaurant around the area the girls' flat was located in, the girls agreed to let him move in. But in the 2 weeks Jesse lived with them, the girls started to feel that something just wasn't quite right. He never seemed to go to work, always seemed to be either at the gym working out or going on dates with other girls, and he just wasn't acting like someone who was trying to buy a restaurant. They asked him to leave, expecting to have come to an agreement where he could stay for a couple more weeks until he found a new place to be, but Jesse told them that he understood. He packed up his things and left the same night. He moved into the City Life Hotel, where he rented a room from a landlord who owned a few of the private apartments in the building, and he told his new landlord that he was a manager at a Woolworths and that he had just arrived in Australia. Jesse told him that his father was on the board of directors for the Woolworths chain, and that Jesse was moving to run a local store where he'd be earning more than $150,000 a year and would even have a company car. Jesse made a good impression on his new landlord, who said he seemed to know a lot about supermarkets and that Jesse's story of wanting to live in modest accommodations so he could spend more on having fun and socialising seemed to add up, so he let Jesse move in. And Jesse looked the part. He was always well dressed, spent a lot of time working out and swimming at the gym and pool that was in the building, but already by his first rent and deposit payment, his story started to get a bit flimsy. He paid his landlord using benefit checks, but he was able to explain this away by saying that there was a delay with his paycheck that was going to be sorted out soon. He used the same excuse when he couldn't pay his next month's rent and promised his landlord that he would pay the month he owed plus a month in advance when this issue with the paycheck was resolved, but his landlord had a hard time believing that. He was actually getting ready to confront Jesse again and start the process of evicting him when Jesse was arrested for murder on December the 9th, 2018. On December the 1st, Jesse and Grace Millane met over Tinder and agreed to go out for a date. They were spotted leaving the apartment building and heading into town through CCTV cameras, where they enjoyed a few drinks together and headed back to the building they both lived in. While on the date, Grace sent several text messages to a friend telling her that the date was going, and she wrote, "I just click with him so well." That was maybe why Grace wanted the date to continue, and she agreed to go into Jesse's apartment, but in keeping with Jesse's history of lying, there are several versions to explain what happened next. What we do know for sure is that Grace didn't respond to calls and messages her family left her on the next day for her birthday. At first, they blamed the time difference and thought that Grace was out enjoying herself, but when they didn't hear from her for 3 days, they called the police and reported her missing. It didn't take the police long to hone in on Jesse, who was the last person that Grace had been seen with, and the pair had been spotted together during their date on CCTV. By the 8th of December, he was arrested and charged with murder, even though they had no body. But Grace was found, buried in a shallow grave off Scenic Drive in the Waitakere Ranges the very next day. When an autopsy report revealed that she died by asphyxiation, Jesse told the police what had happened. He said that he'd just lost his job on the 1st of December, and he and Grace had matched on Tinder and gone out on a date. He admitted that he was a bit of a heavy drinker, something that he blamed on his father being an alcoholic, and that he'd been drinking that night, but his date with Grace had gone well anyway. They went back to his room where Grace had asked him to strangle her while they were having sex. Jesse admitted that he was into bondage and sadomasochism, something that other women who'd matched with him on Tinder would corroborate, but that when he complied and strangled Grace like she'd asked him on that night, he'd ended up killing her by accident. Not knowing what to do and in a state of panic, he rented a car, drove her body out to where it had been found and buried her, but a search of his home would reveal that that was not the full story. After Grace had died, Jesse had taken intimate pictures with her body, done several internet searches on how to get rid of a corpse, watched porn, and then gone on a Tinder date with another woman. It was only after doing all that Jesse had actually tried to hide Grace's body, but this was the time that all of his lies would catch up with him. He pleaded not guilty at court, and when the case went to trial, but he was found unanimously guilty by a jury of 12 peers and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 17 years. He tried to appeal his sentence, with his defence lawyers arguing that the prosecution didn't have any proof that Jesse had intentionally killed Grace and that this wasn't a case of a consensual sexual act resulting in an accident, but he's been denied at every turn. And his sentencing came as a great relief to Grace's family. Her father, David, flew out to New Zealand to bring her home, where her family and friends buried her in a cemetery in Essex. Her funeral opened with the hymn Amazing Grace, followed by her brothers reading a poem called Until We Meet Again, and the head investigator in her case flew out from New Zealand to be at the funeral to show support to her family. The Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, made a public apology to Grace and her family shortly after her body had been discovered. She said, "On behalf of New Zealand, I want to apologise. Your daughter should have been safe here, and she wasn't."